whether or not you experience at any given moment type 1, good tired, or type 2, bad tired, it also has to do with dopamine, because dopamine receptors in the brain are joined with the type 2 receptors. So when dopamine gets activated, it actively just inhibits type 2. If you say that you have effort with a lot of dopamine, you are going to end up with good tired. That's why making sure that you're protecting dopamine and making sure that you're recycling adenosine properly to make sure that as we go through the day, we're never tipping into bad tired.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the OptimalWork podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be back here with you again.
Yeah, Sharif, it is great to be back with you.
Yeah, and I'm excited to continue here our series on energy and tiredness, and more broadly, we're going to get, to depression, but it's been great so far diving into the biology and the science of adenosine, so.
Yeah, and this to me is some of the most practical neuroscience people will ever hear. And the other great thing is, this is very much the cutting edge. The new understanding of how adenosine relates to the experience that people have in the course of your ordinary day. And so the things that we're going to be talking about are just things that people can test out in their own life and see exactly how it works. So I think it's, in terms of experiential neuroscience, this is some of the most fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, so at towards the end of the last episode, we'd been getting just kind of scratching the surface of the distinction between good tired and bad tired. So I think that's kind of our focus for this episode, is understanding the difference, how that connects to adenosine, and then how to be able to attain good tired as opposed to bad tired.
Yeah, that's right. So people could wonder, is good and bad tired, is it just different levels of tiredness? So that if I'm moderately tired, that's one thing. And if I'm very tired, then that's bad tired. So is it like the difference between being a little fatigued and being totally exhausted? And the fascinating thing is the answer is no. They are not the same. They're not degrees of tiredness. In fact, they are two different types of tiredness, which correspond very neatly to two different types of adenosine receptors. And that's something I tried to not mention because I don't want to be overwhelming people with details. But for this episode, we really do need to look into great detail at the different types of adenosine receptors in our brain. So there's a technical way of naming them. And so the main two types are A1 and A2A. But I'll just call those type 1 and type 2. Turns out there's also an A2B and an A3, but those are not triggered, we think, in ordinary life. So there are things that happen in extreme tissue damage or ischemia or really extreme circumstances that would trigger these other ones, because they only get triggered at extremely high levels of adenosine, non-physiologic levels of adenosine. So in ordinary life, we have these two receptor types, but they do get triggered depending on the level of adenosine in a given space. So there are going to be these three different areas we're going to look at, and each of them will have type 1 and type 2 receptors. And so if there's just a little bit of adenosine that's there, then the type 1 gets triggered. And gradually over time, that will build up as sleep pressure. And that's the good tired feeling. And it's true then, if you get in certain local areas, the excessive adenosine, then you start binding the type 2 receptor. And that's what it feels like, bad tired. So type 1 receptors, their whole thing is to tell a neuron, calm down. You're working really hard, just you take a break. And so it's not actually so much from the neuron that the adenosine comes. It's actually that when the neuron's working really hard, it needs energy. And then the supporting cells, these astrocytes, will give the neurons energy in a form of called lactate. But when it gives them lactate, it also will put out ATP, which then gets in between the neurons, cleaved to adenosine right away. And not doing work, just cleaved. And then that signals the neuron, hey, I know you're working hard. So here's some energy, but here's also a signal telling you that you can kind of keep calm a bit, just to make sure neurons are protected from being overexcited.
I don't know if we can even just back up a little bit and give some of the more basic like neuroscience and human biology. But I mean, when you say, so you have adenosine, which is kind of, a molecule that's floating around, and then you have these receptors of different types all around your brain. On each neuron has many different receptors.
Yeah, so it's going to have these two types, and it's primarily in three areas actually of the brain. There's the whole cortex, and then there's something called the striatum, which is a smaller area, and which is involved with effort. And then, so the cortex is involved in thinking. The striatum is involved with effort. And then there's the deeper center called the lateral septum, which is involved with motivation, the deeper motive and bonds that we have. And so there's this balancing act that takes place, in each of these levels. And so the neurons then will have, when they're working, and the supporting cells around them, the astrocytes, can tell they're working. The neurons then will need more energy from the astrocytes because neurons are not really good, flexible with coming up with new energy of their own. That's what astrocytes are for. So like a third maybe of all the cells in the cortex are astrocytes, meant to just support what the neurons are doing. So we typically think of the brain as like all neurons, but that's actually not the picture. Astrocytes are a huge part of the brain. And in psychiatry, we had kind of neglected astrocytes. And the new movement is really starting to see, wow, these supporting cells give energy to neurons and then signal through adenosine. So it's a really remarkable new system that's being discovered.
Mm-hmm.
When you have the type 1 receptors then at lower levels of adenosine being triggered, the neurons kind of calm down a bit. Then over time, that builds up as what's called sleep pressure, which is a more chronic type 1 activation. But it's a very different thing when you start getting into the type 2. Type 2 will make you feel that your effort in this area is futile. You start to feel a sense of despair. So at its height, it's actually a despair of putting in any more effort. Now that's meant to also protect us from doing things that are not good for us, that are not going to pay off. And so it turns out then in the course of our ordinary day, we'll get into, it's the way that we are living and working in the course of each day that determines whether we have more type 1, good tired, or type 2, bad tired. And so the way that we're living has a very direct effect on which of these receptors will have a dominant effect. So how does that sound as a general overview?
Yeah, that sounds right. And it just occurred to me that, as you're talking about, so your brain is trying to prevent you from investing a lot of energy into something that, it sees as impossible somehow. And that immediately then kind of gets me thinking about things like procrastination, breaking the need to break things down into smaller steps. So that would then all be tied in, I imagine, and we'll kind of get to those more.
Yep, exactly. So we're going to get to all that. Because the other thing then, it's whether or not you experience at any given moment type 1, good tired, or type 2, bad tired, it's not simply a question of the level of adenosine. It also has to do, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. I'll try to make it as simple as possible, with dopamine. Because dopamine receptors in the brain are joined, they're called heterodimers, with the type 2 receptors. So when dopamine gets activated, it actively just inhibits type 2. So that makes a huge difference then in your experience of good or bad tired. So much so that if you say that you have effort with a lot of dopamine, you are going to end up with good tired. That's going to be a type 1 effect because the dopamine will turn off the ability, to some extent, of those type 2 receptors to respond. So that's why, as we're going to get into it, making sure that you're protecting dopamine and making sure that you're recycling adenosine properly are like at the heart of each of the things that we can do to make sure that as we go through the day, we're never tipping into bad tired.
Yeah. That's great. So, Kevin, I imagine that a lot of the things, you're going to suggest that people do to get type 1 tired as opposed to type 2 tired, good tired instead of bad tired, is going to be things that we often recommend as OptimalWork kind of best practices. And then I wonder if maybe we can just distinguish also between, okay, how do you, looking forward to your day, structure your day, or prepare yourself to get to type 1 tired as good tired as opposed to bad tired, but then also thinking about if someone finds themselves in a state of bad tired, what should they do?
Yep. Good. Perfect. Let's keep those things in mind. Yeah. Because almost nothing in your experience of your brain is as directly shapeable as good tired and bad tired. So they respond very well to these different approaches. And as you're going to see, it's really core OptimalWork approaches that work on these different levels. Everything in OptimalWork is going to always come down to reframing and mindfulness and challenge. And in fact, that's going to be the same thing here, but it has its own twists. Yeah. So broadly speaking, we're always thinking then of every activity is going to produce some tiredness because there's going to be some effort. But whether it's good or bad tired depends on 3 things. The first and most important is your motive for doing the work. If that motive is tied to bonds with real people or potential in your life, if there's people that you can think of serving, if there's love that can come into that work, that is the most fundamental thing that you can do to make sure that all the effort registers, in fact, as good tired, right? But then you also need, on top of that, the habit of working in sprints with breaks. So the structure of the day is what allows you to make sure that you're continually in the good tired zone and not tipping into the bad tired. So sprints up to 90 minutes and breaks, 15 minutes. And then the last thing is sequential unitasking. When you're actually in a work sprint, mindfully doing one step at a time until it's done.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Out of curiosity, you had mentioned earlier 3 brain regions. And, I'm not that good memorizing brain regions, but I'm not good yet. But the first one, or one of them you mentioned was tied to motivation. And then your first one here was, working with motives of love and service. So that seems kind of tied together. I was just wondering if the other 2 are kind of related to each
Precisely
brain region
they are.
that you would. Okay.
Yes. So we're going to go through actually that, in fact, these 3 behaviors that I just outlined are how you tip each of the different regions to type 1, not type 2. Yeah, so that's great. The love and service one that you were just mentioning, that is this part of the brain that has only recently been kind of deeply studied. It's called the lateral septum. I'm not going to go into like a great deal of the neuroscience around it. It's part of the limbic system. It's a part that's actually really, really hard to study. So we've been studying it in mice. And in 2023, Nature Communications posted this fascinating study that came out of a Chinese lab that showed that if you trigger type 2 adenosine receptors in the lateral septum of mice, you immediately see despair behaviors. It causes this immediate depression. And you can see how rodents respond, like, because they stop swimming. If you put them in water, they just don't swim. And also very fascinating, if you block those same type 2 receptors in the lateral septum from being able to be stimulated, you see the erasing of all despair behaviors. So there's a kind of switch that we see in mice, that and rats, that when it's turned on by adenosine. And when it's turned on, you get despair. And then if you block it, they're protected from despair. Okay, that's a very big finding. Now, this is of course really hard to study in humans. So far, the closest we've come are post-mortem studies, where in people who have committed suicide, and they found that you in fact have an increased number of adenosine type 2 receptors in the lateral septum of these people. So it shows that likely you're having this much higher activity. So when these are activated, or you could say what seems to make adenosine type 2 get triggered there is meaningless effort. So if the work you're doing is not tied to any meaning at all, then it seems that you're more prone to building up adenosine there. And what works against it, in fact, is things like dopamine and really fascinating oxytocin, which is what you get when you experience a bond. So oxytocin and dopamine, and there's other factors too. But basically when people are working for the sake of bonds, and ideals are always so close to bonds, because you're trying to be generous, well, that's going to be pointing you towards bonds and so on. So when you're working like that, you are perhaps very directly blocking those adenosine type 2 receptors in the lateral septum, kind of protecting your ability to be motivated. So there's this really fascinating thing that the more you have a love in your work, the more protected you are from despair. And so it seems that humans are actually wired to derive hope from love. I think that's an incredibly deep point, that this gets into our deepest motivations, because the lateral septum is known to be like the region most involved with social motivation and most affected by isolation. So it's a common thing then when people have bad tired, is that they're alienated from others and their work feels alienated from really helping others and serving them. And they're also alienated from the ideals that would make them more bondable in the rest of their life. So reframing is the skill that puts ideals and bonds front and center in our work. So normally think of reframing as something happening in the upper cortex, because it's part of the thing. And of course, that's really important. But an effect of the reframe is that you actually secure deeper social motivation, which protects you from kind of this deepest level of feeling bad tired.
Well, I have to say, Kevin, this is great news because, I like to think of, the essence of optimal work is that working for motives of love and service perfects your brain. That's what I think. And
That's a
so
big
I see that
theme,
here.
isn't it?
That's a big, yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
pretty big. And I was kind of, in the last episode, just worried that if it's all about getting sunlight and eating dark chocolate or whatever, that we're not, getting to love and service and challenging ourselves for the sake of love and service. So it's good to see that that's, at the center of things here.
That is great. It is great. Yeah. You mentioned dark chocolate. Caffeine actually is specifically a type 2 blocker. So we actually block bad tired specifically with caffeine. It also seems to do something with the type 1 receptors, but we know that if you knock out the type 2 receptors in mice, they have no effect of caffeine. So it seemed to be that somehow it's mostly through type 2. The next part would be going then up a level. And this gets to the center of the brain called the striatum. Now, we've talked about the striatum because we talked about the dorsal shift when we were talking about addictions, and that this is like, so I don't want to go into a very deep dive right now in the striatum, but just to say that this is all about the coordination of effort. So like longer bouts of effort, right? And so here, marathons are the worst thing you can do for the striatum because the sustained effort over hours and hours and hours pushes it into the type 2 adenosine activation. So what is best for the striatum is a kind of phasic pattern where it's on fully and then off fully. And then that can repeat. And then what happens is your striatum is able to just have a small amount of adenosine that's only hitting the type 1 receptors. So by the end of a sprint, you feel a little bit tired. But that tiredness is counteracted by the achievement of the sprint. So as you're accomplishing a good sprint, there's a sense of victory. Now, this is especially the case if you've set a real challenge in the sprint that you're stretching for. If you are able to work in a sprint and stretch yourself and make progress towards that challenge, even if it's not totally there, as long as you made progress, you get a powerful dopamine surge in the striatum. That dopamine surge will shut down the ability to some extent of your type 2 receptors to respond to adenosine. So even if it went high, you're still protected. And then the breaks allow you to clear out adenosine to ensure then that you're ready for the next sprint. So if you just have the habit of, one of the things that you see in people who complain of bad, tired, feeling unmotivated in their work, if you're feeling like you're always having to push through in your work, anytime you're white knuckling or pushing through, you're actually using your striatum in a way to kind of get it to pour out the adenosine. So that's why we don't really ever want to push through. We want to set bounded challenges, a time-bounded challenge up to 90 minutes. That's magic for your striatum. It's not that hard for it, but once you go beyond 90 minutes, now it has to work very hard to keep the effort up. And you can tell if you're like using willpower to push through.
Mm-hmm. So, well, that's wonderful. So you want to, I guess this thing of setting a clear goal and a stop time, which is like such core optimal work. Like when I advise people as they're starting to do optimal work, how to do a golden hour, those are the two things I mentioned.
And that gives you sustainable energy through the day. Yeah. And then also it's important, like, what do people do on breaks? Great breaks might be outside because the bright light that helps you to actually clear adenosine. It helps activate your astrocytes. Movement helps to clear it out. So in my office, I have kettlebell, and it is really helpful, to take a break and just to do 10 reps, with squats with the kettlebell. Simple movements that cause a little bit of exertion, but it takes like a minute. It's like it's not a big thing, are surprisingly replenishing, because that physical movement also stimulates your astrocytes to vacuum up the adenosine. So being well hydrated, helps there. So there's all these things that we can do that on the breaks to make sure they're really restful. Any kind of parasympathetic activation. So that could be talking with loved ones. It could be some kind of silent prayer. It could be mindfulness. Those things all activate your parasympathetic nervous system, and that helps you to vacuum up more and clear out the adenosine. So that restores you then for the next time of work. What probably doesn't restore your adenosine is scrolling. So, it's probably good that the eyes be able to unfocus a bit. That's some of the benefits of being outside, but so that there's not so that even your visual cortex is able to have a time of break instead of the tight focus of a screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. And then, so the last one that you mentioned is, or the third thing. So after working with motives of love and service, working in sprints and breaks, and those obviously go together because it's easier to maintain and reset your motive when you do take breaks. When you work in a long marathon, you tend to lose sight of your original motivation, I think.
That's right. And so they do certainly fit together. And then the third one just builds on that. Yeah, and that's mindful unitasking or sequential unitasking. And that's about the cortex, because this is where multitasking, switching from things without finishing them, is one of the fastest ways to produce bad tiredness. So if you want to, try like listening to something you're really interested in while composing an email, and you'll get the quickest feeling of bad tired. Or like I said last time, start composing an email but don't finish it. Then start composing another one and don't finish it. And very rapidly you'll get this feeling. This is at the level of the cortex. And so when you're switching between focuses, that takes a lot of, has a high cognitive load. So you are generating adenosine very quickly by doing that. It's surprisingly easy for your cortex to attend to one thing for a while. That doesn't take a whole lot from it, but continually switching. So the ideal state of your cortex is that when you sit down to work, you can fully mindfully activate your task attention, be completely engaged with that task, and finish each step before you move on to the next. So with that mindful way of going through your work step by step, laying out the steps in advance is also hugely helpful, because then you're going to have less talking needed in your background processor, your default attention, trying to predict what you're going to do next. So sequential unitasking means less adenosine is generated, because it's easiest to attend to one thing than to keep switching. And it also means that every time you finish a little step in your work, that's a little win, and you get dopamine. And that dopamine blunts the type 2 receptors in your cortex, so they're not going to be as active. So think of putting steps in a task you're about to do as setting up little dopamine replenishments. These are the things that will help to make sure you're always tilting towards the type 1 adenosine. And then you generate less of it by not quickly switching between things. The same actually goes for like worry and ruminating. Mindfulness as a solution to worrying and ruminating, mindfulness generates less adenosine. And it's much easier. So training yourself, the secret always is to try to finish every step you start. Then the effort that generated adenosine is always balanced out by the dopamine of a small win. And the way these things kind of layer on top of each other is that even if your work is very meaningful, if you're doing marathons, you're going to get bad tired. Okay, then even if your work is meaningful and you're working in sprints and breaks, if you're multitasking, you're going to be generating bad tiredness. So it really takes these three things. And it means tilting towards the type 1 good tiredness and minimizing adenosine accumulation at the level of your motive, the deeper lateral septum, or at least more medial lateral septum. And then you have with the effort itself, in the striatum, and then you have with the thinking, the engagement with the task in the level of the cortex. Each of these things there are very simple ways which OptimalWork is always encouraging people to do. And so you can see that really is reframing and challenge and mindfulness. Each in their way comes to the fore. So all the elements of a golden hour will help you to only finish your day with good tiredness. So you'll build up great sleep pressure, and then will be thriving in work and in life.
That's wonderful, Kevin. I think that ties it all together here for us, this connection of good tired, bad tired, and way of working. So I think this is a perfect episode here. And then we'll be back next week. I don't know if you want to just give a one sentence of where we're going to take this next week.
Yeah. So there are two things that then we have to look a little more deeply at, which is what happens when bad tired accumulates day after day, right? Even one day, even one period actually of very intense generating a bad tiredness through, say, multitasking can impact motivation for days. But then what happens when that's repeated is burnout. So it'd be great that we talk a bit about burnout. And then the other topic that we want to go into is the special case of depression. which is now that you understand these levels, you'll see it's a fascinating account of what I think is now the newest understanding of depression, and also the most hopeful.
Well, I look forward to it. Thanks, Kevin.
Great. Thank you, Sharif.
All right, we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.